Okay, students, welcome back. Quick review from our first video. We left off talking about the larynx, which is the voice box right here. Just above the top of the trachea is the larynx, what you and I call the Adam's apple. Quick review, it's made up of 9 cartilage plates. Quick review, those cartilages are the thyroid cartilage, just 1, the cricoid cartilage, just 1, the arytenoid cartilage, there's 2 of those, it's a pair. The corniculate cartilage, there's 2 of those, it's a pair. The cuneiform cartilage, 2, a pair. And finally, the epiglottis, 1, single. All 8 of those 9 are made up of hyaline cartilage tissue, except the epiglottis, which is made up of elastic cartilage. Real quick, the function of the epiglottis is to close that trachea when we swallow food so that food doesn't go down our windpipe. Also, what controls that epiglottis movement is something called the swallow reflex. That is controlled in the brainstem at the pons and medulla. So when we start to swallow food, the muscular activity in the pharynx sends a signal to the pons and medulla, which then sends another signal back to first the soft palate. The soft palate raises up so that food doesn't go up into the nasopharynx. And then the epiglottis closes down so that food, as it goes downward, doesn't go down the trachea, it gets pushed back to the esophagus. All right, now to the trachea. The trachea is just a windpipe, that's all it is. It's a tube. It's a little more sophisticated than just a tube. I'll talk a little bit about it, but basically it's just an air conducting pathway and it's a tube. Here's the specifics about the trachea. There are 4 layers of tissue that make up the trachea. And the layers, as I number them, or they're numbered on these notes that I gave you, 1, 2, 3, 4. Number 1 is the lining of the trachea, and then we go outward toward the outside of the trachea to number 4. So number 1 is called the mucosa. You've probably heard that before. That's usually the inside lining. We have a mucosal layer in our mouth, in the pharynx, also in the trachea, also in the digestive system. That mucosa lining gets its name because it secretes mucus, which, by the way, this coronavirus, that's where it attacks. It implants itself into our mucosal membranes, in our eyes, in our mouth, in our pharynx, and that's where it first attacks us. Okay, so the first layer of the trachea, the mucosa, that's a layer name. What makes up the mucosa? It's made up of pseudostratified columnar epithelium that's ciliated. The functions of that layer and those cells, those specific cells, are they secrete mucus. There are things called goblet cells interspersed amongst those pseudostratified columnar epithelial cells. So there's pseudostratified columnar epithelium, goblet cells, which secrete mucus. Also on the pseudostratified columnar cells, there are cilia, those little hair-like structures, and what they do mostly is movement of debris. They propel things that we inhale that shouldn't get down our respiratory system. They propel them back out. The second layer is called the submucosa. So the mucosa lines the inside of the trachea. The submucosa is deep to that. That's why it's called submucosa. The main thing about that layer is that it contains things called seromucous glands. These are sort of donut-shaped, circular, simple columnar epithelial glands that secrete a watery-based mucus. When we cough, when we clear our throats, that's where a lot of that water-based mucus comes from. Seromucous glands in the submucosa. The third layer, which is deep to the submucosa, is the adventitia. The adventitia is basically just a layer of connective tissue that's there for structure. It helps hold the other layers together and helps give that soft tissue some sort of physical structure. Finally, the outside layer of the trachea is made up of hyaline cartilage. Now, it's not just all one solid layer of hyaline cartilage. There are rings of hyaline cartilage. And when we look at the trachea, it's from the outside, it sort of looks like this. Here's the top where the glottis is, and then the trachea, the windpipe, sort of takes on this shape. and we can actually see rings, cartilage rings embedded in tissue in the trachea like this. Now those cartilage rings, their main function is that they hold the trachea open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We need constant air supply in order to survive, even while we're sleeping, even while we're unconscious. And the trachea, those cartilage rings hold that tube open all the time. Now, if we were to take a bird's eye view up here and look down into the trachea like this, those cartilage rings, here's the tube of the trachea. The cartilage rings are open in the back like this. So that's a bird's eye view of one of those hyaline cartilage rings. The reason that they're open back here, it's not a full connection of a circle, is because the esophagus sits right behind the trachea. That's for food. When we swallow a large bolus of food, that puts pressure on the trachea right here. And this openness expands, sort of like one of those Halloween rings that little kids wear, those spider rings that have an opening in the back, that allows it to open up. So when a large bolus of food is going down, those trachea rings open up in the back to relieve pressure so that we don't suffocate. Next on the notes, the trachealis muscle, which is just a skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle means we have conscious control over it. The trachealis muscle, when it contracts, we get a cough response. So when you do a voluntary cough, you make yourself cough, that's coming from not only chest muscles in the thorax, but also the trachealis muscle. When it contracts the trachea and it compresses the trachea in diameter and causes a coughing type of action. The carina, some people call it carina, C-A-R-I-N-A. That is a little flap of cartilage at the base of the trachea. So the trachea comes down and it divides into the primary bronchi like this. So this is the trachea. These are the two primary bronchi, singular is bronchus, and the carina cartilage sits right here and it sticks up like a little fingernail right at the base of the trachea where the bronchi bifurcate. When this little piece of cartilage is stimulated from debris or something, or mucus buildup, that gives us a deep cough reflex. That is not voluntarily controlled. The respiratory tree, in the notes I just wrote, know how it branches from the primary bronchi, secondary bronchi, tertiary. Respiratory tree, just picture a tree growing out in your yard and hang it upside down. So the trachea would represent the main trunk, primary bronchi would be the first two branches, and then tertiary bronchi would branch off like this. And then quaternary bronchi, which are just smaller divisions. You can see why now we call this the respiratory tree, because it actually takes on a tree shape hanging upside down. So trachea, primary bronchi, secondary bronchi, tertiary bronchi, quaternary bronchi, down to what we call bronchioles. And I wrote this on your note. Bronchioles, when they branch, they're less than 1 millimeter in diameter, and then respiratory bronchioles are less than ½ of a millimeter in diameter. At the base of this respiratory tree, at the base of these tiny bronchioles, are little tiny air sacs. They almost look like bunches of grapes. It's these air sacs that we call the alveoli. Alveoli is plural. Alveolus would be singular if you're just talking about one. So these little air sacs are at the dead ends of these terminal bronchioles. So each of these little balloons is an air sac. It's called an alveolus. This is actually where gas exchange occurs, in the alveolus. I'm gonna draw a large alveolus here. This is one of these tiny little air sacs. It's just like a miniature balloon. The wall of this balloon is what's in contact with the pulmonary capillaries. So just give me a moment here to get out, see if I have a red piece of chalk. There we go. I don't know if this will show up for you or not. This is a pink piece of colored chalk. The pulmonary capillaries actually drape over the surface of this alveolus like this. So this is a little tiny air balloon with little tiny capillaries draped over this. Picture like a spider web all over the surface of a balloon. We call the connection, the physical connection between the wall of the alveolus and the wall of the pulmonary capillary, the respiratory membrane, because that's where gas exchange occurs. Oxygen comes all the way into this airspace when we inhale. Then that oxygen diffuses across the wall of this balloon and into the pulmonary capillary, into the blood system. That point, which is external respiration, gas exchange, that's why we call this the respiratory membrane. Now the wall of this alveolus is made up of, this is the surface I'm drawing. Picture it like a latex balloon. That latex itself is made up of simple squamous epithelial cells. They're really thin. Picture like super thin walled membrane made up of these really flat cells. That's the wall of this balloon. We call those simple squamous epithelial cells type 1 cells. That's where gas exchange occurs. But interspersed within, sort of between those type 1 cells, the simple squamous epithelial cells, are what we call type 2 cells. So these little green blobs right here that I've drawn would be type 2 cells. I'll label that type 1 cell, simple squamous epithelium for diffusion. Type 2 cell, that's a cell that secretes surfactant. Surfactant is just, it's a fluid, and it almost acts like a detergent, not just for cleansing capabilities, but what surfactant does, it's a fluid that's secreted by these cells in our alveoli, and technically it decreases the cohesive properties of water. What does all that mean? An alveolus balloon like this is distended so that air can come into it. That air that comes in is warmed and moistened as it comes down our respiratory system passageways, and that moist air has some moisture, some droplets, water droplets in the air itself. We don't want these balloons to do this, to close and stick shut. Okay, think if you were filling up a balloon with water. You know that even after you empty the water out of it, the walls of that balloon stick shut like this. We don't want that to happen in our lungs. It's very difficult to open those. So we want those alveoli to stay open all the time. What surfactant does, it's a detergent-like fluid that decreases the cohesive properties of water so that our alveoli won't stick shut like this should they close. It also makes inhaling take a lot less energy from the body. So it keeps those airways open like this and not stuck shut should the walls of those balloons meet. Anatomy of the, where are we? Sorry, just give me a moment. I'm looking at my notes that I gave you. Talked about the trachealis muscle, respiratory tree, bronchioles, terminal bronchioles. One thing that I didn't mention in this respiratory tree, it's loaded with hyaline cartilage up here in the trachea, primary bronchi, even into the secondary, tertiary bronchi. But as we go down into these smaller airway tubes, the cartilage content decreases and the elastic fibers and the smooth muscle content increases. Also, when we get all the way down here, we don't have pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelial cells anymore. That tissue turns into simple cuboidal epithelial cells. That helps with secretion and a little bit of diffusion. So we have a lot of cartilage up here. It decreases as we go down here. We have little smooth muscle and elastic fiber up here, but that increases as we come down. Also down in these alveolar spaces, in the walls of the alveoli, we have macrophages that hang out here. We don't have cilia anymore, so we don't have the ability for cilia to propel things out of our air spaces way down here. So macrophages act as a defense mechanism to phagocytize debris or foreign microorganisms that get all the way down into our alveoli. All right, I'm going to briefly talk about the anatomy of the lungs, and then we'll call this video good. The anatomy of the lungs and pleura. Left lung has 2 lobes, and the right lung has 3 lobes in the human, that is, different in all mammals. Our left lung is a little bit smaller than the right side, and it only has 2 lobes. In theory, that's to give room for the heart, because our heart's in the thorax sits on our left side. So the left lung has this space sort of carved out of it called the cardiac notch, and that's to make space for the heart. Each lung lobe is divided into bronchopulmonary segments. That just means if we were to take a lung lobe, individual lung lobe, and then slice it open and look into it, there are these hexagonal shapes called segments in each lobe. That's a good thing from surgical standpoint of view, because should the alveoli or the lung get damaged in a particular lobe, it's sort of separated from the rest of the other lobes of the lung. So you've probably heard of people having a partial lung removed. Usually what happens is a whole segment of a lung can be removed without compromising the other tissue in there. In the lungs itself, it's mostly, other than the alveoli themselves, it's mostly elastic tissue. Also highly vascularized. Not only are the pulmonary capillaries draped over the alveoli, but the lung tissue themselves have a blood supply coming to them. So it's a highly vascular organ. There's also a lot of enzymes that hang out in this area, particularly cardiovascular enzymes. And I wrote in the notes, for example, angiotensin converting enzyme. That's an enzyme that is active in the lungs, the pulmonary capillaries, and it's suspected, it's theorized that the reason that those enzymes hang out in the pulmonary capillaries is because so much of our circulation, as a matter of fact, one complete rotation, all of our blood in our bodies gets pumped through our lungs every minute. So it's a high trafficked area of blood supply. So enzymes that act on the blood typically hang out in the lungs because they're going to be exposed to the constituents of the blood more often. The nerve supply to the lungs is called the pulmonary plexus. Pulmonary just means lungs or respiratory system. Plexus, what that word means is just sort of like a nest of nerve fibers. There are other plexuses in the body. So the pulmonary plexus is the nerve supply that innervates the lung tissue itself. Sympathetic fibers coming from the spinal cord constrict our bronchioles, our air passageways, and parasympathetic fibers coming from our spinal cord dilate those passageways. So if you remember, a sympathetic nervous system is fight or flight, parasympathetic is rest and digest. Obviously, when we're resting and relaxed, we want our bronchial airways to be dilated. All right, we're going to call that good for video number 2. I'll be back shortly with video number 3. You can always email me with any questions. Talk soon. Hope everybody's well.